Amy Dune. Is she believable? She's what? She's very believable? Interesting. And you say she's completely unbelievable. How would we describe her? I mean, we've met some female gothic monsters. And
Shrewd.
Shrewd, yes, very shrewd. Very excellent description, yeah, extremely shrewd. Is she shrewder than Ellen or shrewder than Medea? Either von Trier's adaptation or
I believe so.
you think that Amy takes the cake?
She's on a new level.
By far.
She's on another level.
By far.
Well, can you elaborate?
Oh. It's like, okay, in Alan, when Alan was shrewd, but like she didn't know how to use herself, like without harming herself to harm her husband.
Well,
Like,
that's a very interesting look, one that didn't come up yet earlier today. So, okay, she's unaware of unaware of herself.
But this lady is like knows her full potential. She knows like what she can do and what she's capable of, and she uses all of it to destroy. Like,
Okay.
Everybody.
So when we're talking about comparison and contrast papers, and we're looking at similarities and differences, obviously we can take some key points between the three characters and between the three films. So some of what we mapped earlier today dealt with the idea of sociopathology, which they all seem to share. And then we looked at the treatment of children, because in each one there's the treatment of children. We looked at narrative structures and endings, and of course any retrospective narrative that you need to know in order to understand fully or to have some sense of comprehension of the absolutely incomprehensible. Mostly, I think, because we're dealing with subversive narratives, we have to think of that author-work-reader triadic relationship, and we have to try to figure out, okay, what is John Stahl? What's his social commentary? What is he trying to say? And what is the vehicle that he's using to sort of, explain certain disenchantments he might have? And of course, using women as those kind of those characters becomes even more interesting, because we're always with the gaze, particularly cinematically, we're always staring, looking, burrowing into them, trying to understand what motivates them, the shrewdness, and then we see other characters responding to them, and often aggressively, in frustration. So tensions and atmospheres build, and it becomes really intense. Another place that we could see the similarities and differences is through the treatment of murder or murders. And then we have the bedroom scene, which is on our analysis exam. And then we have women seen in split terms, whore or, mother, angel, or demon. And then, of course, we have something that we didn't discuss, which, is at the core of everything we're doing, this notion of the stereotype, and then, of course, the unbelonging, or the marginalization, and, othering that goes on. And so most of these women characters, we can arguably say, are others. Yeah, they don't represent the typical, and they don't represent the conventional or the traditional. So let's look just quickly for a second before we come back to this. Let's just look at the women characters in this film. Because really this film is interesting from the point of view that it has that narrative structure that we've seen even with the 1945 Leave Her to Heaven, where the end is the beginning. So we cycle back, and it has that sort of punning of cyclicalness, because they're very sick films in terms of the sort of ways in which they take up love, marriage, and family values. Certainly the ideology that American policy was trying to espouse in 1945 is subversively called into question by John Stahl with the construction of Ellen Berendt, that kind of Black Widow spider that will stop at nothing to make sure that nobody has Richard Harland if she can't have him, which is the same relationship she has to her father. So, you know, I don't think Richard Harland really is anything but a kind of hologram of Ellen Berendt's father. And, you know, sadly, I think this is one of the richest things in terms of analysis that you've come up with, because Amy Dunne is incredibly manipulative. She's, you know, that's why we call it witches, bitches, and sorceresses, right? This is the kind of way in which we're looking at them. But the interesting thing is that Amy, she's a Harvard graduate. She seemingly has it all. She's, you know, like this class act with this whole ensemble of appearance. And yet she's probably one of the most strangely insecure and dangerous women we've met as a result of it. You know, she also has that duality in that she makes herself very unattractive. She'll stop at nothing as well to harm herself, self-harm, and she, you know, takes a toothbrush or something and a hammer and hammers out her teeth, so she'll have this horrible lisp, and so that I guess she'll look a little disfigured, and then she packs on like what, 500 pounds, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but she's just constantly eating, which is interesting as a kind of visual pun, because it speaks to our digestion of this kind of violent, hostile drama where we're not getting enough, and sensationalism and all the problems that are associated with media, and particularly social forms of media, things like what do we go on Twitters and Instagrams and Facebooks, and it's only in the last couple of years that I've really sort of engaged with that world. And you know, as we know from what Flynn and Fincher are telling us, that world is a manufactured world. That world is full of constructs, full of deceptions, disillusionment. The people we meet on there, unless we know them, generally they don't have any relationship to us whatsoever, and it's what we project or how we incorporate ourselves into those relationships. And what Fincher is doing really cleverly here is he's personifying the social media as probably the central monster of the film itself, or of the story itself. And I think he's doing a really good job of it, because he's showing how easily we're manipulated, and how it takes, you know, nothing for us to all of a sudden be on this side of the fence and then be on that side of the fence. And we don't have any discernment anymore, and we don't seem to be able to think things through or counsel ourselves. It's all about information, and then, well, given that information, we take it as fact, and then we base that fact on how we respond and empathize in the world. And you know, this is a particularly, for me, a particularly sad state of affairs, and scary, very scary. So for me, this film is, or this book and text is very scary. What I find even more compelling is that Amy, the construction of Amy, Gillian Flynn is a woman writer. She was, you know, at first interested in journalism. There's an interview in the Rolling Stone magazine, you can look it up. And she talks about how women, you know, are always complaining about their characterizations, and feminists are always discussing how, you know, women are subordinated, or they're not treated kindly, the treatment of them, usually they're voiceless, or that they're stereotypically sexualized and objectified. I mean, all the old narrative threads, all the old stories, and you know, they're true, and I think we need to sort of find a new way to rail against what has been extant forever and ever with women and oppression, or with any identity and oppression. So, you know, when I thought of the kind of pornography that exists in this film too. I was looking at the ways in which Flynn and Fincher are kind of pointing out our fantasy lives, our fantasy worlds, and how these kinds of fables we tell ourselves about how our sexuality should be, and what intimacy looks like, and what marriage looks like, and what happy family looks like, and you know, these sadomasochistic relationships that are just on display. And I mean, the bedroom scenes, the two that stand out that can be talked about and compared in really significant ways are obviously the box cutter scene. And I mean, there are all these dark, humorous moments, like where he'll say something like, you know, well, where did she get the box cutter? It's sort of like somebody choking on a sandwich and you're at the funeral and you're asking them, well, what kind of sandwich? You know, it's like one of those moments. And they're really interesting moments that I think can be analyzed in significant ways. I just looked like a big piece of poo, but it wasn't. Oops. Anyways. Okay, so yeah, where am I? Okay, so let's look in terms of the stereotypes. Let's just look at the female characters, because the reason Flynn says she does this is to kind of break down those constructions and deconstruct the idea that women can't be threatening, that women can't be predatory, that women don't have those motivations within them and can be psychopaths or sociopaths. You know, Fatal Attraction was like that sort of classic epitome of woman gone nuts or whatever, and wanted to have like the family that she couldn't have, and seduces this man, and it gets out of control, and whatever the story goes. But she goes and boils the child's rabbit, and she does all these like horrible psychotic things. And it's interesting that Glenn Close later on, talking about the film, said, you know, if I had done a little bit more research, I mean, it became such a cult classic and success for her. She said, but if I had done a little bit more research, I would have discovered that representation isn't helping anything in terms of women and madness, or the history of the female malady from Victorian times even onward, but just that it isn't really making us understand what motivates women to behave in these erratic, delusional ways, to go and, you know, dramatize it in this hyperbole or hyperbolic way isn't helping. And she said if she had to do it again, she would do it differently. I don't think Flynn is in that camp. I think Flynn really wants to celebrate these evil incarnations of women, and if we can do it with male villains and male characters, she's suggesting that why should women be exempt from those roles or those characterizations? And that's something we have to think about, because, I mean, for a long time, nobody's ever really gone like they do when there's a psychotic male character. I mean, you go, because you look at their behavior and think, you know, what's wrong with their brain? But you don't question it in the same way that when you take a woman, it becomes incredibly subversive, right? And you know, people in the last class, one student in particular was saying, well, why couldn't she just be like Ruth? I said, Ruth is from 1945. That's a whole other world. We're in the 21st century. And when they say, well, you know, this steps it up a notch, that's why I said this is a kind of commentary on the Medea type of figure, right? Who's going to stop at nothing for revenge. And always related to betrayal. You know, it's always the male betrayal, and the woman can't control her emotions and her anger, and so she becomes a psychopath. I mean, it's kind of not very original, really. So I'm not sure what Flynn is saying there. But just to say, if you look at all of the female characters, and we kind of delineated them here, Amy, of course, as I said, she writes these texts, Amazing Amy, and those texts are telling us all the limitations that she sees in herself. So Amy, you know, tries tries out for varsity or whatever, an amazing Amy wins, right? So whatever she couldn't accomplish or do, her character accomplishes and does. And of course that perfectionism is part of what undergirds or underlies the trauma that she's experiencing, and the pressure that she puts on herself is as a result of parenting as well, because she has a very difficult mother, right? Her mother has high expectations, they need her, they live off her reserves economically, so she, you know, has these other factors that contribute to her imbalance and obviously unsettled spirit, so to speak. So, you know, you have Andy, who's the girlfriend of Nick Dunn. She's what, 19? She's his student. So what these women help to do is to kind of construct this male character as being incredibly flawed and ignoble, lacking integrity, kind of a transparent ego maniac who is not much of anything. He's a hack writer. He doesn't have a lot of real contribution to make to the world. He plays video games and Battleship, and he runs a bar where he drinks bourbon at 11 in the morning with his sister. So they've really made him into an undesirable character in an interesting way, but at the same time, he becomes in a way the victim. So it's very ironic how these characters all become great ironies, I think, and contradictions, which create all the tensions, including the social media and the kind of media frenzy that just looks so silly in the film. Like, I find the film often very, very silly. Margot, the sister, she, very classic, stereotypical woman who knows that her brother is limited and knows in some ways about Amy and Amy's troubles, but really doesn't do much to alter anything, just sort of blithely ignores things and acquiesces to whatever her brother wants, and then cries at the end because her brother goes back to Amy and says, well, I don't have much of a choice, which again, it's always about choices, right? They're not deterministic narratives from the point of view that they maybe can't escape the fate, but they're definitely all these characters' choices have a role to play in their resistance to their determinism or to their fates. Okay, so then you have Detective Boney. Well, she's really sad. Why is she sad, stereotypically? Well, first of all, she's a female cop in a world of cops that are incompetent. Like, it's almost like black humor. You have them coming in, and she's really taking the job seriously, and they don't care. Like, she's like putting little sticky notes on everything, right? Yeah? Well, oh, a blood splattered there. We're gonna solve the case, you know, as she's on the case. Detective Bonehead is what it should really read. And she's not well liked or well received, and she's even called incompetent, and she's made to feel that because of her wanting to work the case out and actually coming fairly close to realizing who's really responsible for everything, the cops throw their hands up, and the detectives, because it's a woman, and say, well, no, we're not, you know, just, it's enough. You're off the case, you're done, you're finished. And she's also divorced. So, you know, and one of my students said that they thought she was a lesbian. So maybe she has that sort of construction of a kind of more or less feminized, whatever that means, but a less objectified, sexualized woman. Like, you're not looking at her with desirability with the same gaze, right? When we're looking at Amy and she's in her, you know, Amy, she's a gaze. We're riveted on her, the way she moves, her gestures, the way she carries herself, every eye movement, everything she does. And that's deliberate. I mean, she may not be the most attractive woman, but there's something incredibly compelling about the way in which she's kind of incorporated those character traits that make her this mystery of incomprehensibility and almost caricature. The mother we talked about. Now, one of my favorite characters is the pregnant lady. The pregnant lady, she has no name. I always love nameless characters because nameless characters, you can imagine what they can be called, what they would be called. So if you name the pregnant lady, what name comes to mind?
Local idiot.
Stupid? No, I mean a real name. A real name.
Martha.
Martha. Perfect. Or Peggy. Or I mean, I don't want to diminish. I don't want to diminish anybody's name, but we can think of Martha Stewart or something, right? Because really, although Martha Stewart went to prison and she was pretty savvy for the most part, so we can't really include Martha because she did time. And the pregnant lady, she would die in jail. She wouldn't even know what to do, right? Okay, so, but I think Martha's jail cell was fairly sizable, and I think she might have sort of like The Sopranos had like carpets, Persian carpets in hers, and maybe even cupcake trays or whatever. Maybe she even had an easy bake oven or something. I don't know. Anyways, I'm just making fun. And the pregnant lady, why do I like her so much? Well, first of all, she's really obnoxious. How would you characterize her? Come on.
She's hyperactive.
She's hyperactive, yeah.
Overactive.
Yeah, she's like soccer mom, over-determined, super stereotyped. Her voice, you remember her voice, the tone?
High pitch.
High pitch, so grating, right? And then you have her juxtaposed next to Amy. And what do you have?
Overattrached.
What?
She's over-attached. Like, Amy and her were just friends. Right?
She's kind of
And the way she's reacting
She's
towards
clingy.
Nick is like, shows that she's like so much attached to Amy, while Amy doesn't care.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, she is. She's like a succubus or something, or I don't know what you call
Local
those
idiot.
things.
Local idiot.
Say it again?
Local idiot or something.
Oh, the local, oh yeah, I thought you were naming a plant. But the local idiot could be a plant. That would be a great idea. We'll just call all, what do they call, village idiots? Local, village, whatever, yeah. You had a comment.
Yeah, I said she's gullible.
She's
Gullible.
Gullible.
gullible. Yeah. That's a great description. She's, yeah, gullible. And I think that's why she makes me laugh, because I really try hard to sort of be gullible, but I've never really been able to do it. I don't know about you guys, but I don't see, like, she's a suburban woman who represents subversively the kind of voice of that American dream turned nightmare. She's the upright version of what the policy on marriage, family, Christianity, you know, no free choice, things of that nature. You know, have many babies. A baby is everything in America. A pregnant woman is like a piece of gold in America, okay? So you have this kind of narrative voice that shows you the underbelly of that dream as being a very deceitful and dishonest delusion that keeps getting disseminated, because what's really going on in America is not what is happening in that suburban center where they moved from New York. And the thing is that suburbia, they show it as being a very vacant, very isolating, very vacuous space. And they do it on purpose, I think, because the idea is that you're going to be safe in the suburbs. Nobody's going to get you. And in America, you can own a gun. So if anybody comes to your house, you've got this whole elaborate security system, and then you can also have a gun, right? So the suburbs are supposed to represent that safety. But really what they're saying is that what goes on in the suburbs, and this is a subversive undergirding narrative, is that it's really dark. it's super dark what's happening behind closed doors, so to speak. And the same is true when we go back to Greece and the importance of the house. The house is everything. But what goes on in private and public, that theme again of private and public, becomes really important. So the pregnant lady is one of her, I guess, her minions and one of her manipulations, because even the story itself is phenomenally interesting from the point of view of truths and how the lies we tell ourselves, and nation building and nation identity. And so you have this woman who constructs a false journal, a diary, a first-person confession, which is completely unreliable. I mean, all these narratives in first person are not reliable narratives, and you always have to keep that in mind. And you have this woman who's like saying, this is what it's really like in America, and we have it great, and it's the American dream, and I'm having another baby. And this is really not the truth. And then you have Andy, who's like, you know, this kind of demon slut who is characterized that way. And then all of a sudden on social media, or in the media, on the news, fake news, real news, not news, maybe news, whatever, she's all of a sudden dressed like a nun, and you know, her collar's choking her before her shirt was her shirt was off, and then she's being choked like a nun. And so she's seen in split terms, and you know, she's of course an innocent made into another victim. So it's interesting how Flynn is playing with all these different roles and stereotypes. And even if you wanted to talk about in your stylistic analysis, when we get to analyzing the passage that's on the test, if you wanted to talk about, you know, how to summarize it, we're not going to summarize it, well, sociopathic woman kills, you know, ex-boyfriend to, you know, give a lesson to, you know, teach her her current husband a lesson. I mean, just the idea that Amy goes to the lengths that she goes to punish him is absurd, right? So what is the notion of absurdity and satire here? Well, satire is a deliberate strategy. It is the narrative device at work here. It's the same kind of device that's at work in John Stahl. So if you want to write a thesis statement that's going to work for your test, that's going to show the complexity, you're going to talk about how satire works subversively to somehow unpack all of these false ideologies, all these cloaks, ruses that are worn by these American ideals. And then you have, of course, the personification of social media. And don't forget Greta. Who's Greta? Greta's, again, one of the more interesting characters. Greta's the girl at the hotel that steals all of her money. Right? It's a great day for Greta. Greedy Greta, right? And her boyfriend. She knew she was a con from day one. She played her, and she didn't realize she was being played. That's the only time we see that she doesn't hold the, whatever you call it, the ball in her hands, right? That's when her strategy and all of her machinations break down. And I mean, sorry, go ahead. The whole idea of her wanting to kill herself,
Yeah, she cut it out of her calendar.
she cut it out of her calendar, right?
Yeah.
Which her calendar is really absurd as well.
She
She
has
let it all out before.
planned it out.
She cut it out because she realized what she says is that her husband knew her best of all, right? You know me to my marrow. We know each other to our marrows. No, you're psycho. Really, that's really, okay. So what's interesting in terms of the similarities and the differences between these three representations of female Gothic monsters that becomes really important is they're all masterminding. They're all using manipulative ways to seek betrayal and revenge. Interestingly, Medea is victorious and she's justified, culturally important, whether we agree or disagree with what she does. Each one of these has a narrative structure that depends on some kind of retrospective narrative point of view. You know, I imagine it opens with, Nick imagining breaking his woman's, that sounds terrible, breaking Amy's skull, smashing Amy's skull, what goes on in her mind, wondering what she's thinking, what's, where they're at. So it's all a lot of internal things going on too that create this kind of confessional, cyclical, and there's a pun there, cyclical, because these are pretty sick narratives. So you've got the cyclical story, and you have the backstory of the Golden Fleece, and if you don't have that backstory, the story of Medea becomes not as clear in terms of how we might negotiate or make sense or navigate the characters and flesh them out. And then you have, of course, the treatment of the children in Lars von Trier versus the treatment of the children in Euripides, and obviously the anguish, the tension, the intensity of Medea's determination to wound Jason, even though she's already annihilated and decimated the royal family, is very difficult for her in that. Amy, on the other hand, in a contrast, Amy decides to have a child, which speaks to the problem of children in terms of American family values, because if you're having children for these kinds of reasons, then we're populating our nation with children that are going to be disenfranchised, marginalized, products of monsters. So there's another subversive social commentary right there that you could write about. Certainly, if you have a lot of kids in single parent family relationships, economically it's really tough, and you have to pay for a lot of things to raise a child, and you can't do it in America. You can barely, if you read Joan Didion, you can barely do 4 full-time jobs at Walmart or something and different places like that and make ends meet. So, we're in tough economic times here, so obviously Fincher and Flynn are pointing to those things as well in this kind of satirical play. And the treatment of children as pawns in the relationships become another area that you can compare and contrast and discuss in terms of the social commentary at work. And then when you see, when I find out that Amy's pregnant, I'm pretty mortified. I have to say, I'm like, oh Lord. Then you have Ellen Barrett, who's willing, like you said, she's so unaware of the consequences of what could potentially happen. She's willing to throw herself down the stairs, but not before she matches her costume with the wallpaper and with, everything else, her shoes and her cosmetics and whatever else, and hurl herself down a flight of stairs to kill her unborn fetus or child. I think you can still say safely it's a fetus or whatever, and then not to have to endure the pangs of childbirth. So you have a lot you can work with the ways in which children are depicted. Okay, and just to say the bedroom scene, a great analysis for comparison and contrast, for instance, would be the use of Desi and the horrible sort of strobe light, semi-pornographic, but sadly I think that's satire too, because I think what they're pointing to is the ridiculousness of how we're taught intimacy, or how we as a culture like to peep, like peeping toms, like we like to look in and see but not be seen, and that's that whole sort of play there on watching gratuitous scenes. And then the scene where Nick bashes Amy's head against the wall and she says, "I'm the cunt you married," and it's very violent language, and it's a very hostile and violent and aggressive scene. What is the purpose of the violence? It's not just there because we need to have violence. In part, for some audience members, but if we're going to be somewhat scholarly about it, the violence has a significant purpose. So we need to unpack what that purpose is, because we have witnessed a lot of violence in a lot of different contexts in these works that we're looking at. And the violence is usually some buried rage. And when we get to the Gothic romances, characters like Heathcliff and Rochester, they're angry, their childhood traumas, their repressions are very violent and very and they affect other people in significant ways. Okay, so what I suggest then is we probably, do you have questions? Do you have questions about this material so far? I think we've broken it down to at least get a general sense of where we're moving. We haven't talked too much about the male characters, but we're going to come back to the male characters because we're looking at the, you know, the Byronic romantic hero, the anti-hero in the romantic period that we're moving toward. So we'll come and we'll look at Jason and we'll look at Nick Dunn again, and I think we're going to see a pattern in these characterizations as well. You've probably already seen the pattern. Ineffectual, castrated, kind of sadly unconscious male figures. What else do you want to add to that? I mean, they're stereotypes, right? Anything? Okay, well, we can always write about it if you don't want to talk about it. So we can write a response. And we'll come back to it when we come back after the break. Thanks. Okay, 10 minutes.